very much for that. That's all in the past. And I'm a retired old lady now, but I was very honoured to be asked to launch this book. And what we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit out of the wells of ignorance that I have about the book. Then we're going to ask some of the people involved in its creation to involve each other in a discussion about it. So, The Poison of Polygamy by Wang Shiping. It was serialised in 1909-1910 in the Chinese Times in Melbourne. It's the first Chinese-Australian novel and maybe the first Chinese novel. There's a lot of firsts in this book. It was published anonymously, and the authorship of this work was discovered by Mei Feng Kuo. I'll get all my pronunciations wrong. And apparently she said the author was Wang Youkung, editor of the newspaper, who wrote under the pseudonym of Kongha Yilong, also known as Wang Shiping, and sometimes called Joseph. So already I'm reeling. The book is also bilingual, possibly the West's earliest Chinese language novel in English translation. And when I first flipped through the book, I thought, this won't take long to read. I can't read the Chinese pages, and a lot of space is given over to footnotes and I can skip them. How wrong I was. Ely Finch's translation retains many literal or more or less literal translations of common literary tropes, phrases from classical poems with origins in legends and ancient texts. All this sends you, as the reader, over and over to the footnotes until even an ignorant Gualo like me begins to feel the depth and the complexity of the writing. So this evening is also a launch of the translation by Ely Finch, and he also provides us with a substantial discourse on who and why he translated it for and the way he did. And there's a great historical introduction as well by historian Michael Williams. And Mei Fen also contributed an appendix on the newspaper business and Chinese Australians. And there are other appendices in this very complex and intriguing book. And as I say, I feel greatly honoured to be launching it. So welcome to everybody, including family members of Wang Shiping. The translator describes Wang Shiping as a revolutionary firebrand and a Christian preacher, an important figure in Federation Australia's Chinese community. And according to Michael Williams, it's a work that emerged from China's new fiction literary movement that aimed not to tell a story about the world, but to change it. Its purpose was revolutionary. And, I quote Michael, it carried strong moralising overtones and imagined its readership as new citizens in need of enlightenment of the social and political issues of the day. So I thought we might start with the title, The Poison of Polygamy. That is so much like a title for any early 20th century Christian sermon. But when you read it, you discover it's also a rollicking story. As the book's Facebook page says, it's a roller coaster tale of blackmail, murder, betrayal, and even a thylacine attack, pretty ahistorical that bit. It's partly based on real people, places and events, and some of the effectively fictional aspects of the story recount historical events that are known in Australian Chinese history, and all of it addresses significant social issues. So this story has everything. There's Ma, the first wife, or as it's referred to, a married widow, a lonely figure, powerless to find her way in a poverty-stricken little village. There's Xiong Hong, her good-for-nothing husband, Ling Nuong, the matchmaker, Huang Lok, a jilted suitor who, as I understand it, stands in for all Chinese men in Australia who never married because of a lack of women. There's Sui Hei, the concubine, as well as a parade of minor characters. Qing Nam, the wealthy businessman, Wong, the shopkeeper, Song Tak, who bought Sui Hei out from China and continued a sexual liaison with her behind Sui Hong's back. And there's the bandit leader Ah King, who's ravenous with a lust for Ma's daughter-in-law, and so on. So the story rocks on. But it's not really about polygamy, although it is that as well. The role of non-monogamous marriage in any culture is a complex thing. I recall talking to a very modern businesswoman working in Chinatown here in Sydney back in the 1990s, and she told me that she was the child of the sixth wife or concubine, and she used the word wife. And she told me about her father, a somewhat distant figure, but as she knew him, he was kindly and a financial support to her mother, who might otherwise have been penniless. And in a recent biography of Senator Penny Wong, we learn that she is the granddaughter of number 2 wife of someone, and she recalls this grandmother with love and affection. On the other hand, number 2 wife in The Poison of Polygamy is a concubine, a shrew, an evil person, and a murderer. I'm not going to tell you who she murdered because that would spoil the story. But one thing is for sure, Wang Shiping, the Christian preacher and reformer, was seriously down on polygamy. And despite the weaknesses of the novel's anti-hero, the good-for-nothing layabout husband, we do feel for him because he is seriously out of his depth with the conniving vixen of this woman. He's smitten by Sui Hei. He neglects his first wife, and in fact he neglects most things in an opium-addled existence where his association with this woman drags his reputation and his happiness through the mud. It's a ripper of a story, but surely not all polygamy was like this. So if a study of polygamy would be a complex thing, what other things is this novel really about? Well, one of the things it's clearly about is class and the maldistribution of wealth in China, and what we would refer to today as the problem of the 1%. In the early part of the book, a group of men are trekking overland from Robe in South Australia to Bendigo to seek for gold. And after various misfortunes befall them, one of the men, Qing Nam, writes a long poem about the wealth of the Manchu rulers and the poverty of the masses. And when somebody says to him, "Why do you think about national affairs when our very lives out here are in danger?" And the reply is, "That is why we are here in Australia risking our lives. It is the ruling Manchu who, quote, sit and feed, but neither till nor weave. And it is for no other reason but this, that we, from our impoverishment and bankruptcy, must seek our living in foreign countries." He then heaved many a heavy sigh. And that's where that particular instalment in the newspaper ends, and the reader is left to contemplate the truth of this class distinction and the implications of it until the next edition of the paper arrives with a bit more of the racy story. But over the past few weeks since I read it, what sifted to the top of my mind is that Wang Shiping is first and foremost exploring the modern concept of womanhood, and living as he did with social reformers and educated Melbourne Chinese elite at a time of hope that followed Federation in Australia, and also a time of hope that was the ending of the rule of the Manchus of the Qing dynasty in China and the imminent coming of the Republic in China. The book is an articulate and powerfully persuasive treatise on feminism and about the centrality of education, especially of women. If Chinese society is going to reach its fulfillment, says the author, its people must be educated and the old hierarchical ways must go. And I quote from the book, "Alas," he gets really stuck into Chinese women, they are the lowest. "Alas, our country's women are possessed of an especially subservient nature. Their claim to a feminine virtue of feebleness is unique throughout the globe, and it stems from an inability of education to spread, as a result of which their intellects have not been fired. The sorry state of women's rights. He's about firing people's intellects, and this is, to my reading anyway, pure first wave feminism. So the book's about a lot of things. It's a story, it's a racy tale, it's a social treatise, it's a political tome. Now, I've already mentioned the glorious footnotes. There's no time to go into any of this in detail, but I would commend to you footnote 91, where one of the men, Ching Nam, writes an All the River Red tune poem. Down to the footnote to find out what that is. It's about tune poems. That alone provides a whole treatise on this form of poetry. And by the time you've got through that, you have to get up and go and have a cup of tea and then read it again. Or consider the footnote that linked to the man who says, quote, "Am I not the patent round-skulled, square-footed, teeth-concealed, hair-bound picture of a human being?" Down to the footnotes. And roughly translated, I think that says, actually, I'm a good bloke. But by the time you've explored Airlie's explanations of these terms, you are deep into Chinese classical idiom of the three potentials of the universe, and you are all the richer for it. So for someone like me, not fully conversant with Chinese culture at this time, the book is a rich tapestry of learning on many fronts. And as a learning exercise, I think you could undertake to read and digest one footnote a day, and that would take you the next 469 days to do. And I reckon that you would really enjoy it. Airlie Finch says that many readers of the Chinese newspaper who were following the serialised story would have understood its classical and idiomatic allusions, and that with that one small observation, he pulls up today's Australian reader, I think, and makes him or her think a little more deeply about the unconscious racism that all of us carry to some extent. Many people who believe that they are knowledgeable about Australia's Chinese history would find themselves surprised and unprepared to begin to understand the complexity of the Chinese society that comes alive through the pages of this wonderful book. To discover that there are Chinese men, and they are mostly men, in Melbourne who understood these multiple levels of language, and many who would even, and many people who would even be surprised, I think, to know that there were Chinese language newspapers covering the news of active political organisations and Chinese politics. As Michael Williams says in his historical context essay, quote, "The Chinese-Australian experience is often seen in stereotypes, such as when its history is cast merely in terms of racism. For the author of The Poison of Polygamy, racism, at least, is so far as Europeans perpetrated it, not his chief concern. In fact, European Australians feature hardly at all in the book. And what we see in this story is a relatively self-contained Chinese community with generally satisfactory relations with the wider society." End of quote. Now, when Ching Nam is trapped in the collapse of a gold mine, we are told that he'd been supervising several white men as they laboured in the mine. Now, this might seem like a conceit to anyone brought up on the stories of Chinese miners trailing along behind the main diggings, eking out a living from going over the tailings rejected by European miners. That is, unless you had read Michael's historical introduction, where he explains that Wang Shiping's father was manager and a large shareholder in the Hua Canton Quartz Mining Company, a large mining venture in Ballarat. And there's a an image of this, this firm at the beginning of the book. In fact, many of the businesses established in early 20th century in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Darwin and so on were very far from ephemeral. Many of them were very complex. The deep knowledge of people who came and went between Australia and southern China, and the ability to straddle two very different cultures, far outstripped the normal discourse of European settlers. And I'm not going to keep going. I could. There are a lot of stories in this book. There's a lot of fascinating detail. There's a lot of discussion we could have about the language that's used and the way that the translator has translated it. But the deep knowledge of this book does not belong to me. It belongs to others. It belongs to Michael Williams, and it belongs to Early Finch. And I think probably what we're going to do now is I'm going to ask both of those people to come up and tell you something about their experience with this book. And then they and I and two of the grandsons of Wang Shiping we're going to involve ourselves in a bit of a discussion about some of the aspects of this very complex and wonderful book. So I'm not sure whether I'm meant to launch it now or launch it at the end of all that, but if we launch it twice, I think that will be fine. So I just want to say I think it's a fantastic effort. It's a serious piece of scholarship, and it's a great read, and it just works on so many fronts that I think all we can do is to congratulate all the people that have been involved in it, and Sydney Uni Press for publishing it, and just make sure you buy it and read those footnotes. And so I declare it launched, and I'm going to ask, is it Michael first, or
yeah, Michael.
Yes, to come up and just say a few words.